My name is Andrea Kelton Harris, and I'm really honored to welcome you to this morning's Diversity Dialogue. This is the second dialogue for our fiscal 19-20, fiscal 18-19 season. I think I'm a little ahead of myself here. In February is also Black History Month, and I just wanted to share a little bit with you about how Black History Month came into being. On February 12, 2009, the NAACP marked its 100th anniversary. Spurred by growing racial violence in the early 20th century, and particularly by the 1908 race riots in Springfield, Illinois, a group of African-American leaders joined together to form a new permanent civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. February 12th was chosen because it was the centennial anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. And so Black History Month was formed back in where is that? I'm so sorry. It was formed, it started as Negro History Week in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson, a noted African-American scholar, educator, and publisher. And it became a month-long celebration in 1976. And the month of February was chosen again to coincide with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And so the history of Black History Month is not to separate. The origins are not to separate, but to come together and celebrate. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about Black History Month before we get started with today's program. The theme for this year is inclusion and belonging, and today we're going to hear about ways that we can be more inclusive of the LGBTQ community in the workplace. As with other types of difference, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, all of these things have been used to divide people. From the myth that HIV/AIDS is a gay disease, to the myth that you can spot gay, lesbian, trans-identified individuals. What we know and how we think about this community impacts our ability to work together and to do our best work. Today's dialogue will address this complex landscape, and it is my hope that it will both educate and inform while being interactive and introspective. We also believe this is a topic worth exploring more in detail, and we hope this dialogue will provide a useful learning foundation for you to draw upon. Why? Well, to borrow the words used in the report of the President's Task Force on Inclusion and Belonging, our goal is no less than ensuring that Harvard realize its fullest potential. And to do that, we all must feel included, and we all must be included so that we can bring our best selves to the workplace. So today we're privileged to have with us Stephanie Huckel, who's going to lead this dialogue. Stephanie is the Senior Program Manager for Diversity and Inclusion at IGT, a global innovation leader in the gaming industry. In this role, Stephanie has collaborated with internal business units and process owners to develop and deploy the company's first diversity and inclusion strategy. Prior to her work at IGT, Stephanie played a critical role in the development and execution of the D&I function at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island and Bay State Health. She's worked in, with, and for the LGBT community for over 20 years, consulting with businesses, universities, and municipalities on LGBTQ topics. In addition to her full-time work, Stephanie is a board member of the Diversity Inclusion Professionals, a Rhode Island nonprofit serving professionals with a passion for diversity and inclusion. A member of the State of Rhode Island's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Opportunity Advisory Council. And she chairs the governance committee on the board of directors for Sojourner House, an advocacy and resource center for victims and survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence in Rhode Island. So we're really honored to have her with us, and without further ado, I'm going to ask you to welcome her to the stage with a round of applause.
Well, good morning. Oh, see, it's raining outside, but it's a beautiful group of folks in here. I'm really excited to be with you all this morning, and I so very much appreciate the opportunity to spend a couple of hours with you talking about, my most favorite topic to talk about. So like Andrea mentioned, she gave you a little bit of my background, and I'll share with you a little bit more about what IGT is, because I'm going to bet that's foreign to a lot of folks in the room. So we'll skip right there. So IGT, just to give you a little bit of background and understanding of my company. We are $5 billion in revenue. We have 12,000 employees globally, and those employees are spread out over 100 jurisdictions across the world. When I talk about lottery and gaming, I am talking about anything you place a bet on. So lottery, that might be, we have the relationship with, Powerball, for example. We process a number of those bets that folks place. If you placed a bet on one of those Mega Millions, Powerball, massive lotteries a couple of months ago, we had something to do with the processing of that transaction. When we're talking about gaming, we're not talking about video games, we're talking about that interaction at a casino, right? Whether that's on a machine or it has something to do with sports betting. Sports betting, by the way, brand new in the US, but we have been doing this work as a vendor in that space for decades in other countries. So we are really delighted to be able to share that knowledge and experience here in the US now. And jumping back to lottery for a second, not only are we processing transactions and developing the technology that sits behind all those systems, but we are also creating, designing, and printing the scratch tickets. We create that machine that prints the tickets. We created the machine that reads the tickets. So if you have ever placed a bet on anything legally, we have likely been part of that process. So why are we here today? So we're here today because 46% of LGBTQ employees hide who they are at work. And because I am here with you all, and you may have some interaction with students, it may also be interesting for you to know that 20% of college students fear for their physical safety due to their gender identity or perceived sexual orientation. So that does not say 20% of LGBTQ students, it says 20% of students, okay? And those students may or may not be members of the LGBT community, but may simply be perceived as members of the community. We're here because they question your commitment to them, right? Whether they are your colleagues, they are your students. And so today we're going to talk about how do we create a more inclusive space? What do those tools look like? And really importantly, what does the language look like? And why is it important for us to use words that create inclusive space? So we're going to talk a great deal about that this morning, right? Because ultimately, the message we want to send is you are welcome here. So a few things that I want to mention before we move on here. I'm making a few assumptions about you all, right? It's my understanding that you all have volunteered to be here. So I'll be transparent about my assumptions. Number one, we all acknowledge that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people are real. They exist. They are human. And they are deserving of the same respect and inclusion that we extend to other members, cisgender and heterosexual members of our communities as well. Two, in our work lives and in our lives as staff and faculty, we're interested in making sure that our LGBTQ colleagues and students are able to contribute at the same level as their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And finally, my assumption is that this is a learning space, right? And learning spaces are not always comfortable, are they? Because our most profound learning often happens when we're leaning into a bit of discomfort, when we're making our minds sort of bend in a new direction. So with that, I'm going to ask that you ask questions throughout. Please don't hold your questions to the end of our time together, because if you have them, then somebody else likely has them. And if we can talk about them in the moment, they're going to be more relevant and more powerful. So please feel free to raise a hand. Is anyone familiar with the term ouch and educate? Okay, so when we're talking today and we're creating some space and some grace for our colleagues as they ask questions and share stories, folks might say things that make us feel a little uncomfortable, right? Maybe it's the way they used a word, maybe it's their tone, maybe it's their facial expression. And if that's something that you're going to get stuck on, then it's my hope that we can sort of hit time out, hit pause, and address that. So ouch and educate is literally, ouch, right? We all know what that means, right? The equivalent of, you stepped on my foot and that really hurt, right? So we're going to hit pause in the conversation, sort of break down what happened, create greater understanding so that we can all move on together. This is really important to me when I'm in a learning space and somebody says something that's like off, right? Internally, my facial expression's like, they said what? And I get that sort of knot in my stomach. And if I don't address it immediately, my mind is stuck there, right? I'm focused on it. What just happened? What did they mean? What did they say? Why didn't I say something? I should have said something. I should say something. Can I still say something? I have gotten so stuck at this point, right, that I'm spiraling down this wild place and unable to even be aware of what else is happening in the room. So I want you to stay with us. I want you to stay with the conversation. And sometimes the only way for us to do that is if we hit pause together. Is that fair? Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to ask for potentially a little bit of confidentiality. I know that there is a room of people. There are potentially people in the other room down the hall. We are a live stream. There might be future. But I'm going to ask you throughout this time to spend some time talking to a neighbor, and they might share some information with you that they don't even necessarily want the rest of the room to know. But you might want to share out at some point. And so I'm going to ask you to not share the story, but share the message. And the same is true for all of our time together, right? You might not want to bring the story, but certainly share the message. Is that fair? All right. So finally, I'm assuming that we're all in different places on the spectrum of learning around LGBTQ identity and inclusion. So some of you might be members of this community. Some of you likely have experience teaching this information in front of some audience, whether that is a room full of people like this, or it's a parent, a friend. And so I am not under the impression I'm the only one with information in the room. It is my hope to learn as much from you as you learned from me today. Right? So on one end of the spectrum, we have the folks that are really knowledgeable. We might have other folks at the other end of the spectrum who are not really sure if they know any gay people. But maybe you have that aunt who's like lived with that woman for 40 years. You're not really sure what's happening. So we're all here together. Okay, so here's our plan for this morning. So we're going to talk about these three things. We'll keep coming back to these so you know where we are in our time together. So we're going to talk a bit about the case for LGBT inclusion. We are going to talk about language. We're going to talk about opportunities for improvement in our environments. All right? So first we're going to talk about some foundational pieces. So let's go ahead and lay those down. So audience participation time. What does it mean when something has an umbrella term? I've facilitated before. I can be quiet. And it turns out there are even microphones. What does it mean when something has an umbrella term? Thank you. Great. I love it when we define things using the word we're defining. That's perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So it's an overarching term that sort of groups together related terms. Is that fair? Okay, great. So a lot of the time, and today I'm going to use a lot, the word queer as an umbrella term. And we mean that to include people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And we do that because that list of letters keeps growing, right? The more we talk about this, the more we create space for people to talk about themselves and their identities and their understanding of the world and of themselves and the way that they relate to other people, right? So when I was an undergrad, I interned at Rhode Island's Queer Youth Center. It's called Youth Pride, Inc. And that's what they called themselves, Queer Youth Center. And so you looked at their mission. They talked about creating space and supporting and advocating for LGBTQIA youth. Got it? And so that's why we sometimes use the word queer as an umbrella term, right? That's a lot of, I didn't make any of that up, by the way. They all stand for something. They all stand for people's very real identities and reflections of who they are, right? There's some other language folks might use instead of queer. So if you are somebody for whom that is not a term to comfortably use, that's okay. In fact, if you are not comfortable using it, or it like creates for you, like you're having an internal ouch moment that you are not raising your hand for, I totally get that. That's okay. I'm not going to force you to use it. Only once have I had a whole group of people actually say it together. That was exciting. Andrew was part of that group. So some other language that folks might use, GSM stands for gender and sexual minorities. I am not a fan of using the word minority when we're talking about people because it sort of puts them in a permanently marginalized state. So that's not my preference, but that's some language that exists out in the world. Also, LGBT plus or LGBTQ plus is sometimes also acts as a good umbrella term for folks. So when we're looking at sort of the umbrella of queer identities, we break those down into sexualities or sexual orientations and gender, right? So we're talking specifically about underrepresented sexualities and genders. So we're looking at sexualities, lesbian, gay, bisexual. We're looking at genders, we're looking at transgender. And when I say transgender, I'm also using transgender as an umbrella term. So we have sort of like a baby umbrella underneath the giant umbrella. And so when I'm using the word transgender as an umbrella term, I'm using it to say that somebody whose gender identity is not in alignment with the sex they were assigned at birth. Okay? Are you still with me? Excellent. Raise your hand if I lose you at some point, and I'll rephrase it and try to make it make more sense. You might have noticed that I use the phrase sex assigned at birth. That's language that's really important. So go ahead, that's the answer to your test. Sex assigned at birth, okay? Not the sex you were at birth, not gender you were born as, sex assigned at birth. Right? When a child is born, there's some adult, usually one with some serious credentials, that says, congratulations, you have a, right? They're basing that on nothing other, usually, basing that on nothing other than what they can see, right? That may or may not reflect the actuality of the science of a person's sex, okay? It is one component of sex, so the most accurate way to describe the pronouns we start using with a child at birth, or even now, as you know, months before that, when somebody has gone and had a test of some sort, some variety, and they were like, we're going to do a gender reveal party. I'm going to reserve my opinion about gender reveal parties for right now. We good here? Okay, great. All right. So, also foundational in our discussion today, each of us has a sex assigned at birth, a gender identity, a gender expression, and sexual orientation. everybody in the room, right? These are not things that are for the other. These are not things that are for LGBTQ people. Everybody. Gonna. And so, Andrea's favorite slide. I give all of the credit that is due for the genderbread person to it's pronounced metrosexual.com. So thank you very much. It's pronounced metrosexual.com. It's always really helpful for me to have somebody with more artistic ability than me. This would be way less pretty a few years ago, trust me. So we're talking about each one of these, right? Sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and attraction or sexual orientation, right? You'll see that in the previous slide there were commas between each one of these things. And now we have separate lines, okay? Which is to say that these are 4 separate and distinct things. One of these does not determine another one of these things. That being said, we make a whole lot of assumptions, but when we check our assumptions, we discover separate and distinct things. Got it? Yes.
I guess I have to say it out loud. What about, so on the bottom, it says nobody, male, maleness, women, female, femininity, masculinity. What about everybody? There's no everybody. Like for people that are attracted to people.
Yeah, so thank you. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so the other thing that's really important to see about this is that each one of these is a spectrum, right? So these are not boxes, they are lines, and sort of think about each one of these little circles as something that is movable across that line, okay? So if we start at sex assigned at birth, we typically think about these as 2 boxes, right? Male or female. Now we have a lot of states, more and more states that are starting to realize that that's not incredibly accurate. I know it's less easy for folks who are like data oriented and they really want those male plus female to equal like 100%. I'm sorry, that's not reality. So we also have folks who don't fit neatly in those boxes when we're looking at sex overall, right? So we talked about often medical providers are the ones who make the decision based on what they can see, right? So that's external genitalia. But we also have internal reproductive organs and chromosomes. For most of us, those things sort of line up really neatly. But for some folks, 1 in 2,000, those things don't line up so neatly, right? And so when those things don't line up neatly, that is usually due to an intersex condition, right? So we're not black and white here, okay? Lots of gray area and lots of gray area in all of these, right? So we have gender identity, right? So that's if you close your eyes and somebody asks you, are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you some shade of gray separate from that? Both, neither, right? A little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? We now have more than ever lots of language to describe that experience that's not the this or that, right? So folks might identify as agender or non-gender or genderqueer. Genderqueer is often also used as an umbrella term. We are all about the umbrella terms in the queer community. So, and another umbrella term to say, yes, not that or that, right? And so these things might also change, most of these things might change over a lifetime, right? There's some movability here. Yeah? Can I explain genderqueer? Sure. Yes. So the question was, can I explain genderqueer? So when we have, if we think of gender instead of 2 buckets, male or female, we'll add a third one that's genderqueer if we're thinking about gender in a really bucketed way. And so genderqueer folks would say, I don't fit in that box, I don't fit in that box, but if I had to pick a box, I'd pick that other one, the one that says other, right? So genderqueer is our term for language and around gender specifically, that's sort of like the other box. Does that help? Great, thank you. We have gender expression, right? So this is how we express ourselves externally, right? So we see identity as sort of our internal reflection of who we are in terms of maleness or femaleness, and gender expression is our outward-facing expression of that, right? This is really determined largely by the societal context that we're living in, right? So what is our local, the society we're living in tell us is masculine, tell us is feminine, right? I'm pretty sure we're all on the same page here, but audience participation time. Give me some examples of things that are masculine. So, what are masculine jobs? Okay, don't tell me what you think. Tell me what society tells you. I heard truck driver. Thanks for leading the charge there. Right, what are some masculine jobs? Construction? Law enforcement? Firefighter? Okay, what are some feminine jobs? Nurse? Teacher? Librarian? Childcare provider? Office support? Yep, absolutely. How do masculine people wear their hair? Short? Bald? I was waiting for it. How do feminine people wear their hair? Long? Curly? Styled? What was that? Elaborate. Takes time for feminine hair. Yep. And then we get to this weird place, like we have decided what masculinity and femininity look like in like every category, right? You can pick any category. What's a feminine sport? Okay. Give me a masculine beverage. Give me a feminine beverage. All of those. Feminine people have lots of options when it comes to alcoholic beverages. Masculine people get beer. Absolutely. Right, we have decided that, like, and there are real consequences to this, right? Like, when I stop to think about it, I think it's very funny, right? We have gendered positively everything. We have decided what the appropriate feminine way to deal with your facial hair is, right? Or body hair in general, right? And beverages and toys and all the things, right? And it's sort of, I think it's funny, right? But also there are real consequences to not fitting into the expectations that people have for you around things that are gendered, right? And I'm sure you all can think of 100 examples. I'm gonna give you one. Group of guys and masculine people are out at the bar. 9 of them order beer, the one on tap, the cheapest draft option. And one of them orders a Cosmo. What are the social implications for that one person in that group? He's feminine. He's gay. Right. There's a lot of mocking happening. You ordered a what? Right? That's like baseline, right? Baseline, right? It can get a lot worse, right? We'll talk a little bit about that too. Gender expression can also change, can change over a lifetime, can change over a week, can change over a day, right? I generally consider myself to be a generally feminine person, but there have solidly been times where I'm like in my sneakers and my comfy jeans and my hooded sweatshirt and a baseball cap and have been told that I am definitely in the wrong bathroom, right? That, by the way, none of our business. Do your own business. Take care of yourself. Please wash your hands. Spent a lot of time in healthcare. Please wash your hands. I ask you to only jump into somebody else's business in the bathroom if you see someone being harassed, okay? Ask you to really step forward there. I know that you all in Massachusetts have talked a lot about this over the past year, okay? Thank you for doing the right thing. And on the other end of the spectrum, there was that day where I had this very lovely wedding, and I wore this very classically lace to the floor little train dress with the Carrie Bradshaw Sex and the City wedding shoes. Thank you. They were beautiful. I still wear them to work on a Friday because I have them. This is about all you can do with this hair, but there was makeup involved, right? Like I can hit that end of the spectrum, right? And I can fall anywhere in between. And lots of us do. And it does not change the fact that I've always identified as a woman, right? Wherever I am on that spectrum of gender expression doesn't change the fact that I'm still a woman, okay? Because these are all separate and distinct things. And then attraction. So think about these as spectrums, right? So we think about attraction to men and we think about attraction to women. And for folks who fit in like very neat boxes, we have words for that, right? So people who are lesbian are, fill in the blank. Women who are attracted to women, or perhaps feminine people who are attracted to feminine people, depending on their own personal definitions, right? Gay people are attracted to the same sex or gender, right? People who are bisexual are. There is some discussion about this, okay? So I'll sort of go with the default to old school definition. People who are attracted to men and women. Folks in the bisexual community are certainly expanding that language to more of what I would describe as a pansexual definition, right? So folks who have attractions across a spectrum to people across a spectrum of identities, right? And then we have folks who are asexual. So folks who don't have the same attractions to other folks that we might think of in this way, really specifically. Does that make sense? Okay. Does that answer your question from earlier? Yes. Sort of.
People don't talk about pansexuality very much.
Yeah.
So oftentimes we feel like we're having a conversation about everybody else.
Uh-huh.
So it's just nice to like hear the word said.
Yeah. I'm going to say it again in this room. There's a very real sexual orientation, pansexual, right? Folks who are pansexual have their very own flag. We all have a flag now. It's great. And so folks who have attractions across a spectrum. There are also folks who might define their sexual orientation as queer, right? So to just mean I am attracted to people across. I am not heterosexual. That's sort of what queer means in my mind around sexual orientation, right? Just not that box, right? In a really rigid way. Yeah, question?
I have a question about gender identity. When you were talking about genderqueer,
Yeah.
is non-binary the same as genderqueer? Because I hear the term non-binary in reference to gender identity as well. Where does the term non-binary fit in?
So I would use those synonymously.
Okay.
Yes. And like really thinking about it, I would. And so the thing that I'll also say about all of the language that I'm sharing today is that this is my general understanding of how the majority of folks who are in the know are using this language, right? it is not reflective of how every person is going to use these words for themselves. And so if you ever hear someone using a word that's different, using it in a different way that you might know it to be, ask. That might be uncomfortable for you. I encourage you to lean into that discomfort as an opportunity for learning, right? And relationship building potentially, right? Which is to say, don't ask questions like that of like complete strangers unless it seems really appropriate, because that could be awkward fast. Yes?
So the word queer feels like something that you're not necessarily able to say about other people if you are not in the community.
Yeah.
And has at different times been seen as a pejorative word. So I never quite feel comfortable using the term because I don't know that my using it will be understood as supportive rather than hurtful.
Great question. So, who gets to use the word queer, when, and why? I could like write a whole thing on that. I have. So, historically, queer has been an in-group word. Okay, when I say historically, I'm literally going back 30 years, right? Not very long. So before that, yes, queer was used as a pejorative word, right? It was used against people. It was used in violence, right? And for that reason, and this, we're seeing really a generational divide on this. Lots of folks are like, that's a terrible, awful word, and no one should ever, ever use it. And I get that. That's real, right? People have visceral reactions to it. So for example, if I'm talking to a group of gay and lesbian elders, I am not using the word queer unless I'm talking about myself, right? Unless I'm talking about a specific person's identity. I'm not using it as an umbrella term because it's likely to be like triggering in the most literal ways, right? And then we moved to this space where it was very much an in-group word, right? And in-group words are fair, right? In-group words are used by marginalized communities who have so much taken away from them in so many ways. The very least we can give people is a word or two, right? So for a long time, queer was an in-group word, right? That you could use if it was your identity or your community's identity, or sometimes if you were a very close ally. But we're sort of moving, right? So how we use language and define language continues to evolve, right? And so I'd say queer is one of those words that continues to evolve. When I was doing this work 10 years ago, I would say, I'm gonna talk to you about this, but I don't really advise you use it. And we've moved to a different space now. And so make sure that people understand like who you are and your intent, which is usually clear, right? So if I'm talking and I'm saying the queer community, it's very different than me shouting it at someone out my car window, right? People are pretty clear on my intentions there, right? So I would say that we're moving to a place where people who are not queer can use it as an umbrella term, or to talk about a specific person who has shared it as their identity, and sort of and it's appropriate to be talking about that. But I would also add the caveat that maybe don't use it unless you feel comfortable explaining why you're using it and what it means when someone asks you, because they will ask you. Does that answer your question? Yes, okay. It is very nuanced. Yes. I love this quote here from the original creator of this, that gender is one of those things that everyone thinks they understand, but most people don't. Gender is not binary. It's not either or, and in many cases it's both and. It's a bit of this, a dash of that. And so this is intended to be an appetizer, an introduction to the conversation around the complexities and nuances of gender and gender identity. There are a million resources out there to have more, to get more learning. So if this interests you and this is an interesting sort of entry into that discussion, I encourage you to learn more. Any questions here before we move on? Okay, great. Talk a little bit about the case for inclusion. So 50% of non-LGBTQ workers do not think that there are any LGBTQ people at their workplace. I guarantee you they're wrong. And even if they're not wrong, they don't know for sure. Because we don't know unless someone has directly shared with us and been really honest with us about how they experience their own sexual orientation, how they experience their own gender. These are often things that we assume about people, sometimes based on their current relationship, right? So for example, just because someone has been married to someone of the opposite gender, if we think about gender as a binary, for 30 years does not mean they're heterosexual. It means that they're in a heterosexual relationship. It does not speak to their attraction and connections to other people, okay? And similarly, gender or gender identity is not something that we always carry around. Sex assigned at birth is not something that we carry around really publicly, right? We don't know if somebody is cisgender or transgender, transgender as big umbrella transgender, unless they have shared that information with us, right? So I've used the word cisgender a couple of times, so just in case there's questions about that. Someone who is, so we think of cis is the opposite of trans when we're looking at Latin roots, right? So cisgender means someone whose sex assigned at birth is in alignment with their gender identity, right? So if I use myself as an example, I am cisgender, I was labeled female at birth, and I identify as a woman, right? Those things are in alignment, therefore I am cisgender, right? Important thing to know there, cisgender is not a label, it's not a slur, it's not any of that, right? It is just a reflection of a specific set of circumstances. Does that make sense? Okay. 46% of LGBTQ employees hide who they are at work. That's a lot. So the good news here is that 4 years ago, this number was 52%. Good news, bad news. So why is that? So 38% of folks are afraid of being stereotyped. 36% it's because they're afraid they're going to make other people uncomfortable. 31% are really thinking about the possibility of losing connections or relationships with coworkers. And 27% of folks are afraid of, like, they're going to think I'm attracted to them, right? They're not going to want to be in the bathroom or the locker room at the same time as I am because they think I'm looking at them or I'm going to hit on them or this stuff, right? That's real. Right? And this doesn't speak to the layers of, like, I'm not going to tell a coworker because I'm not out to my family, and I'm not out to my family for some very good reasons, right? I could lose a lot of stuff, like my whole life and all my people and my church and my basketball group and, you know, my bridge players, right? There are reasons that people don't come out. So, some information there. So what happens, though, when you have all of these folks who are not sharing this element of who they are at work? What happens? Thanks.
They're not bringing their whole authentic selves to the work, so they're not going to be as productive workers.
Right. People who are, like, purposefully hiding are not bringing their whole selves and not able to really contribute as much as they might be able to otherwise, right? So when I'm saying people who are hiding who they are at work, That's very different than people who are not sharing details of their personal lives. Okay, this sort of nuanced distinction there, but very important one. There are lots of people who are like, I don't talk about my family, I'm not Facebook friends with work people, I just like to compartmentalize this from this. That's totally fair. I'm talking about, and the statistic is speaking to, people who are hiding in a very deliberate way. People who are pretending at work that they don't have a partner. People who are changing the pronouns of their partner to meet a expectation, right? People who are lying about their experience over the weekend because it's going to tell somebody that they're gay or trans, right? Or any of the other things under the umbrella. So when people are spending so much energy literally hiding, thinking about how do I change names and pronouns and not say the wrong thing, and I don't want to, that has very real impact on individuals and their ability to show up, right? So they feel distracted at work. So 28% of those folks are, like I said, literally lying about their personal life to some extent, which, as you can imagine, is exhausting, right? It's exhausting to try to use all of that mental energy to change pronouns and change stories and keep information from other people that you would otherwise share with them if you thought that it was going to be an inclusive and safe environment. And feel unhappy or depressed and are likely looking for another job. FYI. Likely spending a lot of time. US reality for LGBTQ folks. I will say my general statement for what's happening right now is that we have made a lot of progress in the last few decades, and we are now experiencing a full-on attack in a lot of ways. I do not say that lightly. That is not hyperbole. It is bad. And that is for a lot of folks on a state level, and for a great deal of us on a federal level, right? So just a couple of the numbers: 28 states, folks can be fired for being lesbian, bisexual, or gay. 30 states, folks can be fired for being transgender. And last year, over 45 bills were introduced in states across the country to strip LGBTQ people of existing rights or to deny them equal protections or access. We are seeing more and more happen every single day. There's all the stuff that's happening that is not showing up in the news, right? These are all snapshots of headlines. These are the things that make it to the news, right? And with social media, we get to hear about more and more than we ever did before. And still, I guarantee you, there's a great deal that's happening around policy that we're not hearing about. There's a lot that's happening around hate crimes that we're not hearing about. Last year, there was a lot in the news about Jussie Smollett and his experience in Chicago, which is a very big city, right? And we think about cities as being more progressive places. And it was bad, right? It was bad. And why did we hear about it? Because he's really famous, right? Because people don't necessarily know his name, but they're like, that's the gay guy on Empire, right? That's why we know about it. I can tell you that there was a couple within the last couple of weeks in Providence outside a club that got attacked. You know, there are tons and tons of these stories every day in our own cities and our own towns that we never hear about. And so this is why our vocal support and being really deliberate about our language is so important. So despite harsh realities, there are things that are going really well. So thank you.
Hi, if you were to go back 2 slides to all of those different percentages about people's experiences in the workplace,
Yeah.
This study is from 10 years ago, and so I was curious if you had any idea if any of those percentages have changed, especially given the contemporary profile you kind of explained on the next slide.
Yeah, so thank you. Some of these numbers are from, this person has noted the source. So a study that was published in 2009. So it is, I feel comfortable deducing, based on the shift of that first number from the 46% of people hiding, like that has moved from 50 something. So it's a lower number, but still a really high number, right? And so I feel comfortable saying that these percentages might not be accurate 100% 10 years later across the board, but they certainly have not disappeared, right? And they certainly still reflect people's everyday experiences. Does that make sense? So things are really bad in a lot of ways, and I will not say that's not true. And there are a lot of things that are certainly going better than they were a few years ago, right? Marriage equality is now a thing. In my mind, it happened like 1 million years ago, but in reality, it was like less than a handful of years ago, right? And we have lots of companies and coming out and being very publicly supportive in ways that they never would have in the past. I'm not going to play this video for you today, but if you headed to YouTube and you typed in San Francisco Walgreens, this video would show up. And it's about the ways in which companies are leveraging, not just including their LGBTQ employees, but really leveraging them to new levels, right? To reaching out to their customers and communities in new ways. At IGT, as a side note, we very recently launched our LGBTQ employee business resource group. And that has been really powerful for folks. It's chaired by our CEO of North America, and folks are feeling more empowered and supported and like they can show up and be themselves more than they ever have before at this company or at any of our legacy companies. That's really powerful, right? So we're having this interesting experience, which we're seeing in lots of communities and marginalized communities in lots of different ways, or underrepresented folks, excuse me, where on one side we have things that are bad and certainly need attention, and on the other side there are absolutely things that are going well. So I'm going to shift now, and I'm going to give you a pop quiz, because what better place to do that than at Harvard? So we are going to pass out to you a worksheet. I hope you brought pens to take notes. If not, I'm sure that maybe you have a neighbor who brought 2 pens. All right, so I'm going to ask you to find a partner or 2 partners, team up with someone. So go ahead and take a few minutes and fill these out. Some of these terms we've used so far, some of them we haven't. Do your best. I'm good. Thank you. Oh, we're in Rhode Island. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. Okay, great. Awesome, that sounds good. Thank you. Raise your hand if you need more time. All right, we'll give it another minute. All right. What's that?
No. People on mic stream, I'm trying to get them to look at it. So we're just wondering if it's on the slide or not. Yeah, that's on you. Do you need anything else?
Good.
This is great. I'm going to take this home to my daughter.
Good.
My daughter's 15. She
Yeah.
goes to a very hip, independent school where there's so much gender fluid. And she's so impatient with adults. That's why I asked the mom. She says she's non-binary, romantic, asexual, cisgender. I don't know if she's cisgender. No, binary, right? No, she's not cisgender. She's asexual.
You have to ask her.
And she says she's non-binary, romantic, asexual. Never went in sex with anybody. Thank God she's gay. Be in love with men already. And is non-binary. Doesn't have a gender identity. Although her gender expression is female. Got it. I want that.
It's online. You can get it. It's pronounced metrosexual.com.
And then her best friend is she, his sex, it's so hard to talk about it, is born male, its gender expression is male, absolutely, is heterosexual, gender expression male, born male, but gender identity female. And she says she does it just to challenge stereotypes. Because doesn't it? I mean, that's okay.
Yeah.
Her
Why not?
parents are having a really hard time with it. Who are gay, by the way.
All right, folks, we're good. Come on back. Join me. If you hear me, clap once. If you hear me, clap twice. If you hear me, clap 3 times. That's my favorite. Thank you. Welcome. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to review these together. This is not exactly the same for the folks online. Sorry. But we're going to run through this. Okay? So I'm going to ask you all to be brave volunteers, even if you're not certain that your answer is 100% accurate. Deal? All right. Who's raising their hand and says, I have number 1? In the blue. Oh, sorry, you're both wearing shades of blue. I'm sorry. Blue and glasses.
I'm sorry, let me get this to my...
Yes, sexual orientation. I'm going to save our runners by repeating the things. You're welcome. So sexual orientation. So the type of sexual, romantic, emotional, spiritual attraction one feels for others, often labeled based on the gender of the relationship between the person and the people they are attracted to. So a couple of notes here. 1, this is not synonymous with sexual preference. Sexual preference is not the language that we use, okay? Sexual preference describes what you like to do sexually. That is a different conversation. I am not running that workshop. If you want to run that workshop, I know some great sex educators. That's not what I'm doing, okay? So sexual preference, not the language you're looking for there. Sexual orientation is the words that we use for that, okay? Sometimes folks have questions about sexual orientation as it relates to trans folks. So they're like, wait a minute, if their sex was assigned this at birth, but now they identify as this, but they're attracted to these, what? So for most folks, and that's what I'm talking about today, everybody has their own experience and their own language. I am speaking really about broad, generalized experience. Deal? Is it easier for you if I stand up there, or am I okay here? Okay. So for most folks, the sexual orientation is based off of gender identity. Okay? So I'm going to use a famous person as an example because that is much more fair play than me using my friends. Let's see, Laverne Cox, for example. Famous trans woman, Orange is the New Black, okay? Other things, she's fabulous. So she is a woman. Most of you likely know. So Laverne Cox is a trans woman. So she was labeled male at birth, but she's like, you got that wrong. So Laverne Cox is a woman, so a trans woman, who is attracted to men. And so she defines her sexual orientation as heterosexual, right? As a woman who's attracted to men. All right, make sense? All right, questions on sexual orientation? All right, great. Who's got number 2? I'm looking back at you in the other blue. Yeah. Thank you. So gender identity, the internal perception of one's gender and how they label themselves based on how much they align or don't align with what they understand their options for gender to be. Get a little complicated. Common labels include man, woman, genderqueer, trans, and more. I have this really lovely conversation with a lot of folks, and was just having this conversation in the back of the room, that for folks with teenagers, you probably know a lot about this, right? More and more, this is a conversation that folks are having. These are spaces that young people are exploring. It's language that they are creating for us, which is really amazing. Okay, because there are not more gender identities than there were 70 years ago. We just have language for it now, right? We have language, and then we have the capacity for conversations in ways that we didn't before. Okay. Number 3. Thank you. Absolutely. So homophobia is an umbrella term for a range of negative attitudes, for example, fear, anger, intolerance, resentment, erasure, discomfort, that one may have towards members of the LGBTQ community or those perceived to be members of the LGBTQ community. Right, so homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, right, so fear, hatred, whether somebody would individually label their hateful actions or exclusion in that way. That's how we generally bucket that, right? So homophobia is this enormous range of actions or inactions, right? Could be anywhere from purposefully excluding folks from a conversation because they're gay, for example, to hate crimes, right? So homophobia has this really wide range. Same thing is true for biphobia and transphobia, anything else under that. Make sense? You with me? I think we're all clear on the fact that this is alive and well, right? Okay. A few years ago, and so thanks, administration, for this, folks were like, but that doesn't happen. That's not real. That doesn't happen anymore. We've moved past that. But we're here. We're all clear. This is still a very real thing, right? Okay, good. If you still have questions on that, happy to discuss after. Number 4. In the back of the room. Ally, thank you. So a typically straight or cisgender person who supports and respects members of the LGBTQ community, I would say in an actionable way, right? So there's sort of little a ally and big A ally, right? So we have folks who are like, I'm an ally to the LGBTQ community. And for that means they have some gay friends. They really like their friends. And they're happy to have friends who are LGBTQ identified. Great. Capital A allies are folks who are putting their names and sometimes professions and realities on the line to stand up for LGBTQ people and communities and against hatred and intolerance. Okay, and sometimes that means people lose their jobs, right? Sometimes that means people are cutting folks out of their families because they've been cut out, right? All sorts of range of folks. So there's sort of a range of allyship. 5? Who wants to take number 5? Thank you. For 5? Okay. Good try. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes, thank you. So transgender, 1, an umbrella term covering a range of identities that transgress socially defined gender norms, and 2, a person whose gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth. So this is reflective of the fact that we use the word transgender in a couple of different ways. 1 as a big umbrella term, but also people individually might identify as transgender. Does that make sense? Okay. He's now going, well, but where do I put genderqueer? Number 6. Thank you. Yes, 6 is cisgender, the person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are in alignment. Any questions on that? Who learned that for the first time today? Yay, we've learned things. And why is it really important for this word to exist in our vocabulary?
It's kind of hard to talk about something that's not the norm if there's no label for the norm, I think. And it kind of again. I'll be inclusive so everyone can hear me.
Thank you.
Yay. So it's hard to talk about something that is not the norm if you don't have words for the norm. And so, I don't know, whenever I think about this, I think about like the race education that I've done and like understanding it in those terms and then applying it to other topics. So
Yeah, thank you. So if we don't have words that describe the majority, then the language that we end up defaulting to are things like normal, right? Like, we're going to talk to the people who are not normal, right? So cisgender is a really important word. Might not be a word that shows up in your everyday conversation. Might not be as likely not how you're actually describing other people, right? Because you don't really know unless they've told you, because you cannot spot trans people, right? Sometimes we make lots of assumptions, but trans identities also include lots of things we can't see or make assumptions about. Deal? Great. Where are we now? 7. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Genderqueer. A gender identity label often used by people who do not identify with the binary of man, woman, or as an umbrella term for many gender nonconforming or non-binary identities such as agender, bigender, or gender fluid. Questions there? All right, 8. Thank you. LGBTQ, so initials use an umbrella term used to encompass all people who are not heterosexual and not cisgender. And number 9. Thank you. Thank you. Heterosexism is the assumption in individuals or institutions that that every person is heterosexual and that heterosexuality is superior to all other sexualities, right? So interpersonally, I would not say that this comes with aggression or even homophobia, right? This comes from default thinking, right? We think, oh, most people are heterosexual, and so our brains say, unless you get a major visual cue, you should just assume everyone's heterosexual, right? Our brains do this for us. It's part of our unconscious bias, right? It's like if we see a feminine person with a wedding ring, we ask them what their husband's name is, right? So it's like it's like I'm trying to be a good person and create a connection here, a way for us to sort of bond. And so now that person who does not have a husband is now thinking, okay, I was not planning on coming out today. So my options are, I'm gonna lie about it and say, Steve. Or they're going to suggest it is not a wedding ring. It might not be, or something else, right? Or they're gonna say, okay, jumping in with 2 feet, I'm gonna come out and fingers crossed this goes okay, right? If they have the time for that at their water break between meetings, right? So this is not, as an aside, a way to like be politically correct or whatever sort of language we want to use for like, I can't say the things I always said. If you're really interested in creating new relationships with people and greater understanding, then there are a wide range of reasons that you can ask someone about that lovely ring on their hand without assuming the gender of their partner, right? It could be that lovely ring was passed down by their grandmother, who they were very close to, and there's this really amazing story connected to it that you are quite frankly never going to hear if you say, what's your husband's name, right? So all sorts of things. I sort of think about this as the language equivalent to universal design, right? How do we create things that are include more folks, that create a more positive experience for a broader range of people? Does that make sense? Of course, also institutions, we do the same thing. Also, cissexism, I think that's a real word, right? New language gets created all the time, which is things like, no, okay, so I'm gonna give you an example, but it more enforces a gender binary than anything else, right? So job descriptions, for example, might say, this candidate, blah, 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 he or she, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't create any opportunity for non-binary people to imagine themselves in that position, right? Also implies a great deal about the accessibility for your organization for non-binary people, right? And people extract all sorts of information from that you don't intend, right? So those things, but they might also say, okay, so if they're not so good with non-binary people, how are they with gay folks? How are they gonna be with trans folks, right? So even like the language in our job descriptions, right? When we think about, hey, we're doing a company picnic and you're invited to bring a spouse, you're invited to bring your family, right? Well, what does family mean to you? How are we defining that? What does that look like? Who do you actually intend to include? All sorts of things, all right? Number 10. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're like, here's an opportunity for me to show up again. So coming out is the process by which a person accepts or comes to identify their own sexuality or gender identity, or the process by which a person shares their sexuality or gender identity with others. So to come out to friends, this is a phrase I'm going to guess we're all pretty used to. There is, before you have heard about it, a whole process that somebody has already likely experienced and sort of walked themselves through before they introduced you. So responses like, are you sure? Really unnecessary. really unnecessary. They likely would not have shared it with you if they hadn't already given it a little bit of thought, right? Most people do not wake up in the morning and they're like, ooh, oh, maybe I'm a lesbian. I'm going to tell people that today. See what happens. That is not how coming out works for most people. Always create some room. Okay. Number 11. Thank you. Gender expression is the external display of one's gender through a combination of dress, demeanor, social behavior, and other factors, generally measured on a scale of masculinity and femininity. And as we've talked about, also really influenced by the culture you're in. Any other questions about that while we're there? Yeah.
How do you see gender expression playing out in, like, departments? So, like, admittedly, I've been told that not necessarily.
We're going to get you a microphone.
I'm so sorry. I was way in the back.
It's so everyone can hear you.
So my question is regarding gender expression in the workplace, and as a gay male who, I think I am a bit more aggressive on the masculine end, even though sometimes there are times where I'm like, oh, that leopard print's super cute, or something like that. But then I think about how that's going to play at work, or that bright color.
Yeah.
What do you think our departments can do to better, and this goes beyond, gender expression and to so many different levels of expression of who we are and our identities, but how do you think there can be more inclusivity so that if I do want to wear a professionally tailored, bright colored shirt, that's not going to, be a big thing with the CEO of a company? And they're like,
Yeah, I think so there's a couple pieces, right? There's the sort of individual ownership that we have and control we have over how we create space for other people, right? So I might say, like, I really love that shirt. That's an awesome color. And not make a big deal out of it, right? So that's part of it, right? I really love the dogs on your socks. I think they're awesome. You're welcome. Right? So a compliment and like note of appreciation without making it a thing, right? Because we also don't have to be like, I love that pink shirt, right? Unless that's already in our personality, we've like gone to a weird place, quite frankly, where you're like making something where there doesn't need to be a thing, right? And part of it also is like, how do we interact with other people to create the culture we want more broadly, right? So I've said, hey, great shirt, and Joe Schmo says like, oh yeah, real nice, right? That's not the behavior we want to see. That's not very inclusive, right? So one way or another, if we're being a capital A ally, we're going to figure out how to have a conversation with Joe Schmo about why that was not the appropriate thing and how it does not fit in with our organizational values, right? And the things that we expect. Obviously, that's a more accessible conversation to have with a peer or someone who reports to us than it is us versus the president of the university, right? Like those are, we have to find a different way to sort of work the politics around that one. Does that work? Great. Han.
I have it
You
already.
have a mic already. Yes.
I know. So back to our Joe Schmo, like there were a lot of knots in that answer, which I like because it's also true. But there are a lot of ways to like rally Joe Schmo onto the side of understanding by understanding Joe Schmo, right? So, hey Joe, what are you doing? Okay? Like, what's going on? How you feeling? Those kind of conversations where you include Joe Schmo actually make it so that there's not just you in your department, but now Joe goes, oh, actually, I tried to, do something when I was younger and da-da-da-da. You don't know why Joe responded that way, right? So finding a way to loop Joe in is like creating that inclusion that you want Joe to then promote himself or herself or themselves, right? So getting Joe involved in the conversation instead of telling Joe how that's not appropriate actually makes Joe a part of the process of making the company more inclusive.
Yeah. Great points and insight. I very much appreciate that. Because, yeah, it's about the short term, right? Like, it's how do we create space for you, JP? JP is wearing a name tag. I am not psychic. How do we create space for JP and saying, like, how do we support you? But yes, also more long term, right? So we don't want to cut Joe out and say, like, you made an off-color comment. We don't want you here, right? It's about, like, let's talk about how we sort of bring you to the side over here. And you also have a microphone, my friend.
I do, thank you. I also think it's important to consider when we as a community experience the stakes as high. So I think in the day-to-day, when we assume that someone's just going about their business, we may not have a concern about how someone's presenting. But does that lack of concern extend to when we experience the stakes as high? So there's a presentation in front of an external vendor or someone who may be interacting with our office in a way that is not the day-to-day. I think it's important for when that sense of freedom of expression is really valued, that it extends to all of the areas that we work together in.
Great points. Thank you. And I saw a hand over here, and we have do you have a microphone already, or are we? Yes, great.
So one use of a word that's new to me that I heard at a talk on the topic recently, and again today, is the use of the word gender as a verb, to not gender a situation or how much we, gender even inanimate objects.
Yes.
And so for me personally, to kind of further myself as a part of, this whole conversation is to, in greetings, in terms of endearment, and those kinds of things, like find those neutral ways of acknowledging people so that I
Absolutely.
start to sort of rid my own language of gendering things. And then I think by waking up to that phenomenon, it'll be less important on any level to sort of feel the need to categorize, fashion or, actions or beverages
Birthday
or whatever.
cards.
Yeah.
I mean, when I say you can gender anything, it's ridiculous. Yes, thank you. Right, like I did not say, "Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen." That would be quite presumptuous, right? And absolutely, there are ways to look at your own language, and it's usually easier to hear it in other people's language, but then we can be self-reflective about that, right? Right, where are we just creating or reinforcing the gender binary in our language?
Yeah, I have a follow-up comment and proposal to this line of thinking and also what you were saying earlier about the he, she in the job descriptions. Couldn't we make the very simple change of just using the word they
Yes.
everywhere in job descriptions? Like all our online job descriptions just say they.
Yes, that's what we've done at my company.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. They is a nice gender-neutral term that some people use as their own personal pronouns, but that we can also use whenever we don't know someone's pronouns. P.S. We don't actually know what other people's pronouns are unless we ask. I know that's awkward, and I know that it's really easy, right? Earlier, I said he to this person over here. I made an assumption. I'm like, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, that person did not tell you that. You made the assumption based on, to our earlier lines, right? Gender presentation, right? Gender expression, not an individual's identity or anything that they shared with me individually, right? We all have work to do. Isn't that exciting? Where are we now? Are we at 12? Okay, what's 12? Queer, an umbrella term used to mean LGBTQ+, to an identity or label to mean not heterosexual or not cisgender or both, and due to its historical use as derogatory term, is not embraced or used by all members of the LGBTQ community. So we've talked about that. Any other questions about the word queer? How we use it, when to use it, why or why not? We're good. You all feel really good about that. Okay, and last but most certainly not least, we have 13, which is? Yes. Intersex, thank you. So someone whose combination of chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs, or genitals differs from the two expected patterns of male and female. Thank you all very much. Can we give yourselves a round of applause? So thank you. Did you learn something new? Do I have more hands than before? Have you learned something new today? Excellent. Thank you. So let's talk really briefly about the opportunities to improve our environments for LGBTQ people. We've done that a little bit already. Right? We've talked about our individual language. We've talked about institutional language. We've talked about looking at processes. How do we improve them? So some things for you to consider. You're looking at your policies and procedures. I know there are some HR folks in the room, right? So, looking through these, are they inclusive? What do your dress codes say? Those sorts of things. How do we neutralize those? Recruitment and onboarding processes. How do we make sure that LGBTQ folks feel welcomed and valued, even if you don't know that they're LGBTQ? Benefits. So, what level of benefits are LGBTQ folks experiencing in comparison to their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts? Regular communication to employees, what sort of language are we using there? And then something we've been seeing more and more as a best practice are workplace gender transition guidelines. So this is a document that outlines, what happens when a newly out transgender person or a transgender person who is newly transitioning says, "Hi, I'm going to transition," right? That some folks are going to experience significant workplace experiences, right? Some folks are not going to take that so well, right? Some folks are not going to be really thrilled that they now have to call Stephen Sandy and use female pronouns, and that Sandy is now going to use the restroom with Susie and the other S names. And so what is the policy for that, right? And the purpose of that is to make sure that trans folks feel supported, that there's a transparent process that is accessible to them. They know what to expect before approaching that conversation with a superior or someone from HR, right? So that's all really clear. It also helps the HR folks know what to do, because a lot of times what happens is they're like, "Okay, we support you." What does that look like? Don't know how to do that, but we're going to do that, right? So it gives everybody a neat and tidy framework to work within that's really supportive. Okay, so I want you all to take a few minutes, find a partner, and think about what are the opportunities here. And before we do that, we have a question.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, do you have any organizations that can support HR departments or institutions to, create those guidelines, or anyone who's doing it really well that can help guide the process for other institutions?
Absolutely, happy to have that conversation offline afterwards. So find a partner or a couple of other people close to you, and take a moment to think about what opportunities exist in this environment, right? What are the opportunities at Harvard to be more inclusive to LGBTQ folks? And then have that discussion, and then I'm going to ask a few folks to share what you've come up with. So, comments? claps are going to start wrapping up our conversations. All right, if you hear me, clap once. If you hear me, clap twice. If you hear me, clap 3 times. If you hear me, clap 4 times. It's not often to get to 4. What that tells me is that you all are having really exciting, robust conversations that I'm really excited to hear about. So, who wants to share a little bit about what you and your colleague or multiple colleagues were having a conversation about? And we have microphones that are very important. Please.
The mic. I think for us, we talked, one, appreciating this opportunity to have a conversation like this that not only includes a real reflection and refinement of the basics, but then also an opportunity for brainstorming what we can do in our own spaces. And something that we all agreed on was a desire for consistency in conversations like these. So actually, diversity dialogues is such a wonderful, I think, periodic opportunity, but also an ability to take a particular thread, so today being LGBTQ inclusion, and have follow-up conversations about this. And I think that would also give us an opportunity to have deeper conversations, so where we're not necessarily reviewing terminology, but thinking strategically about how do we make sure this conversation is extending to staff, faculty, students, in all the different ways that we engage with community members here at the university.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And there's a hand up here. Getting you a microphone, Mike.
Thanks. So we were actually getting very practical. We both talked about the fact that in our buildings, there are non-gendered bathrooms, but not necessarily good signage to direct people to them. I work in a 6-story building, and there's on the ground floor and on the 5th floor, but if you enter the building on the 1st floor, you just don't know. So that seems like a clear opportunity to be a little bit more open and inclusive.
Absolutely. Definite opportunity there. I can't tell you who to talk to about that, but I'm sure there's somebody in this room who can help you. Yes.
I work in the world of athletics, so it presents some unique challenges. A few years back, we had a varsity athlete who was initially a girl. She transitioned to a boy, and she competed on the men's varsity swimming and diving program. I think that went well. We actually got a lot of favorable publicity about it on 60 Minutes, et cetera, and I think that makes sense. But as a former athlete myself, if a boy or man transitioned to female and competed against me and I would have a much tougher time feeling that the playing field was level, because traditionally that's why we have a separation in sports. You have men's sports, girls' sports, you have women's in boys, because men typically have a greater physical advantage. And I think this is an area where we're going to have to look at science, we're going to have to look at examples, but I don't think we should just sort of blindly assume that the playing field is level if people who identify as male start competing with those who identify as female.
Thank you, Cheryl. So that is an understandable train of thought. I absolutely get that. Good news is there is lots of science that tells us all sorts of stuff about those dynamics, including that folks who are assigned male at birth, who have been on what we classify as female hormones for a specific period of time, there are no physical advantages. I mean, I guess unless you're talking about things like height, which, as we know, women, for example, have a wide range of heights, right? And we don't exclude people from playing sports based on height, right? But in some sports, that is a natural advantage, right? So for things like muscle mass, for example, those are things that hormones do account for. But absolutely an understandable conversation to be having in your area of the universe. Yeah. Other folks? Yes. Oh, we're going to give you a microphone.
We were talking about pronouns.
Yes.
And quite a few people now at the end of their email signature have the pronouns. And we were thinking of going that way in our office. And someone attended a meeting about pronouns that happened a week or so ago. And apparently that isn't always a good idea to make that the norm, because some people don't want to reveal their pronouns. And now I'm a bit confused, because I was thinking that might be a route to go.
That's
now
fair.
I'm not sure.
That's fair. With every bit of all of the conversations that we're having today, there will always be somebody who says, Stephanie was wrong about that thing, right? So I'm going to give you my perspective, which I think of as generally acceptable, although there will always be folks who disagree with something, right? Can we agree on that? There will always be something who will disagree, always be someone, right? So I would not force people to include their pronouns in their signature blocks, okay? I would not force them. I would not make it a requirement, right? I do include my pronouns in my signature block, and I tell other people at my company why I do that, and then it is up to them to make the decision if they are also going to adjust their signature block as well. So for two reasons, I have my pronouns in my signature block. One is I work at an international company. I mean, whether the institution that you work at is global or not, we have a global environment, right? Which is to say that there are names that we don't know how to pronounce. Never mind, do we know what pronouns to use for that name, right? If it's a name that we are not familiar with in our life, that we haven't interacted with before, we're like, I'm gonna guess that maybe based on this, that an A means this person is female, and an O might be masculine, basing that off my understanding of Spanish, but if it's in like an Asian root, I don't know. Right? So it makes life easier. It sort of brings down some anxiety that folks can have about that. And also reduces the likelihood that someone's going to make the wrong assumption. Right? So I work with a really lovely gentleman named Jan. And I work with him in my web stuff at work. And his name is written Jan. And so for a long time, I only saw his name written. And so then we have a conference call, and I'm like, I'm so excited to talk to Jan today. She and I are going to figure this all out. I was wrong on top of wrong. And if my friend Jan had pronouns in their signature block, then I wouldn't have had to embarrass myself in that way. So it avoids some embarrassment, but also creates a sense of normalcy for people who want to share their pronouns but don't know how, right? And so this happens for folks whose gender identity is not super in line with gender presentation, right? So people who have a more like sort of gender ambiguous name or presentation, or both at the same time, right? So Jamie, for example, who sort of shows up in a sort of androgynous way, and everyone's like, and Jamie's like, I don't really want to constantly introduce myself as like, hi, Jamie, she, her, hers, nice to meet you, which is like a nice place to be. Like if we create that universe and culture collectively, that every last one of us is doing that, that's great. Otherwise, it's a little bit awkward. And for like the Jamies out there who do that, I am credit to you, my friends. And so it creates space for people who want to share but don't otherwise have the opportunity, right? It creates a new sense of normalcy for the people who want it. That was my very long answer to your question. Was it helpful? Okay, great. And we have another question right next to you.
Well, we spoke about language, and to point made earlier by Russ, trying to scrub some of our materials to make sure that we look for opportunities to take things that seem very binary and make them more inclusive. But I also wanted to add something about your comment on pronunciation of names. I'm really excited that we're working to add to our directories here something called "This is how you say my name," so that when we search for somebody's name, you could tap a button and hear them pronouncing their name, because I think getting people's names right is really, really important.
Absolutely.
So that's something we're going to have in not too long.
That's an amazing tool. I hear the murmur. People are very excited about this tool. If IGT is watching, I would like this tool. That's great, thank you. And so when you're looking at policies, you're looking at things that are written around not even gender. So like gender, yes, but also sexual orientation has a way of weaving itself in that that heterosexual folks don't often realize. So my one caveat for the folks in the room who are like, I'm gonna go back and scrub all my stuff of he's and she's. Find a diverse group of folks to look at that stuff with you so that you can find more than you're going to find on your own. And last but not least, JP.
I actually think you did in that last little bit, you just answered it. So.
Awesome, thank you. All right, folks, now I did a little bit of Googling about this place called Harvard. And so I want to make sure that you all know that this resource exists, if you don't already, the Office of BGLTQ Student Life. I would love to, if there's, is anybody here who represents that office? I am so excited to talk to you. So I'm hoping that this is a supported plug for your office. But can we give this gentleman a microphone? I'm sorry, can we give this person a microphone so that they can share with us more about this office and resource available?
Hi everyone, I'm Sheehan Scarborough. I direct the Office of BGLTQ Student Life. I'm happy to share why it's BGLTQ and not LGBTQ at some other time. Pronouns are he, him, his. Our office, we fall under the Dean of Students office at the college. So primarily our role is in supporting the undergraduate students, and we work peripherally with some of the graduate students here on campus, including One Queer Harvard, the LGBTQ graduate, Pan Harvard graduate group. So our programs are geared towards undergraduates, but at the same time, I'm also working with a few other staff members across the college on an employee resources group for the LGBTQ community. And so we're hoping at some point to have a website and resources that will cater to the staff and faculty community as well.
Thank you so much. So if you're looking for ways to support students on campus, reach out to our new friend and say, hi, how can I support you? I've given you your script. Okay. Let other folks know that this is a resource, and please, a couple of final reminders from me. Do your real best. As you can see, we're all learning, all working on our language about assumptions that are ingrained in us, especially around gender, but also about partner status and sexual orientation, mirror language that people use with us about themselves. So an example here might be if somebody shares with you that they identify as queer, but that word makes you feel uncomfortable. Don't later, if it's relevant to a conversation, please, don't later call them a lesbian because lesbian is more comfortable for you than queer. Deal? We use language that people use for themselves. That's how we demonstrate respect for them as human beings. And this is sort of similar, like along the same line, names. My name is Stephanie. I go by Stephanie. I don't much answer to Steph, never Steffi. Other like variations thereof, names are really important. Same is also true for lots of other folks, including trans and non-binary folks. mirror language, listen to and follow name requests. Voice does not equal gender. If you're someone who spends a lot of time on the phone, or also a good reminder for folks who work in, for example, drive-through food service, voice does not equal gender. We're all going to work on that. What not to do, I think you're all pretty clear on this. I don't often give people like do nots ever around language, but I'm going to give you a couple here. You can find them on the screen. And don't share a person's LGBTQ identity unless it's clear, very, very clear that you have the permission to do that. It can be very, very dangerous to share that information. Don't ask for information about a person's body parts, sexual practices, or medical information unless you already have that sort of relationship with them. Please. And that's my show. Thank you all so much for this opportunity. Good words?
Hi guys. I am Chris Young, Associate Dean for FAS HR. I just want to close down. The podium comes up to here, so in any event. So on behalf of Dean Gay, let me start by saying another round of applause for Stephanie. Today, I thought I knew a fair bit about this topic, and it taught me that there's a lot more I need to know. And it was done today in an environment, I think, where we all felt safe. We could ask questions. It was done with humor. There was education. So thank you very much. We're growing and learning as a community, and it's very important to be able to have these conversations. To pick up what someone else said, we realize that these diversity dialogues are a starting point, and we are very hopeful of what you talked about, is that you'll take what you learned here today and you'll bring it back into your groups and your departments, and you will take it further with your colleagues. I give you an example. HCL, we now tape the conversations, and they had a forum where they invited their own teams and other folks, and they all listened to the dialogue from last time, because not everybody was able to make it, and they had their own mini dialogue. And Andrea and I, we love that. And so we're going to start this new approach where we're going to ask you, after today, what can you do? What do you want to do? How do you want to take this further? You'll share your stories, and then we'll share that with the rest of the community so we can really expand on this. So first off, thank you all for showing up. I know how busy everybody is at this place, and we're grateful every time that you come and you make the choice to spend time with us. We don't take that for granted at all. I also want to thank Leslie Kerwin and Dean Gay because they show up. They show up with support, they show up with funding, and they show up. And we get to stand up here today and bring you this programming because of that. And so thank you very much for that. So next, so we have a real treat for you in April, where we are, excuse me, we are doing not just a third dialogue. We're going to do a half-day presentation, and it's April 25th, and we're calling it From Diversity to Inclusion, 10 Years of Dialogue. Believe it or not, it's been 10 years of these dialogues. And we're busily preparing that. It'll be start at 8:30, end at 1. We will feed you. And that's all I'll say, other than I think it's going to be special. And Tim Wise is actually going to, a noted activist and author, is going to be our keynote speaker, but there'll be a panel, there'll be a book fair. We're going to invite Stephanie to be on the panel. She may or may not know that. And I think it's going to be a wonderful event, so hopefully you'll come and you'll share this with your friends. Our rally challenge, it continues on ever strong, And the team today, as you came in, and if this was your second dialogue, we decided to give you a little bit of a treat along the way, and you had the choice of one of the books that we've featured in our past dialogues and panels. So thank you to our Rally Challenge, and again, for those folks who come to all 3 dialogues through the year, when they come in April, you will be eligible for a very good prize. It's been a Apple Watch or something along those lines, an iPad. So once again, I've talked too long. Thank you for coming. We'll see you in April. Go in peace. Thank you.